"Those hands don't belong on these clothes." The words sliced through the elegant chatter, silencing the room. Everyone turned to watch as security firmly gripped the weathered hands of an elderly man, pulling him away from the midnight blue suit displayed on the mannequin. His eyes, filled with a lifetime of quiet pride, now reflected only humiliation. The designer showcase manager stepped forward, her Louboutins clicking against marble floors like hammers driving nails into the old man's dignity. She adjusted her gold-rimmed glasses with manicured fingers that had never known a single needle prick, and looked down at him as though he were a stain on her immaculate exhibition. The contrast was painful. Her flawless designer outfit against his simple, well-worn but carefully pressed suit that had seen better decades. Nobody noticed the man in the corner, partially obscured by a crystal champagne fountain, lowering his glass with narrowed eyes. The exclusive Manhattan penthouse breathed wealth from every corner, crystal chandeliers casting diamond-like reflections across the room, waiters balancing trays of champagne worth more than most people's monthly rent. This wasn't just any fashion showcase. It was the most elite preview of Valmont's winter collection, where each handcrafted suit commanded prices that could buy small cars. Invitation cards, embossed with real gold, had been sent only to those whose bank accounts matched their influence. The old man stood out painfully among the glittering crowd, his clean but dated clothes marking him as an intruder in this sanctuary of excess. As security guided him toward the exit, his eyes never left the midnight blue suit, following its contours with the intimate knowledge of someone who knows every stitch. The murmurs began again, rippling through the crowd like expensive perfume. Half amused, half scandalized whispers about the audacity of some people who didn't know their place. In the shadows, Johnny Depp swirled the remaining champagne in his glass, his expression darkening with each second. As the old man reached the edge of the room, his shoulders slumped in defeat, the showcase manager's voice rose above the renewed conversation. "As I was saying, each piece here represents the pinnacle of exclusive craftsmanship, created for those who truly understand value." Her smile was practiced perfection as she gestured toward the midnight blue suit. "This particular piece will start bidding at $120,000. Phones emerged to capture the moment, Instagram stories already being crafted by manicured fingers. Security had almost reached the door with the elderly intruder when a glass clinked loudly against a table. Heads turned. Johnny Depp stepped from the shadows, his presence causing an immediate ripple of excitement. But something in his expression silenced the whispers, a controlled intensity that suggested this wasn't a simple celebrity appearance. He moved with deliberate purpose toward the commotion, and suddenly the old man's humiliation wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of something much bigger than anyone in the room could imagine. The showcase manager, Vivian Lancaster, had orchestrated every detail of this evening with ruthless precision. From the exact temperature of the room to showcase the fabrics at their best, to the carefully curated guest list of New York's wealthiest fashion enthusiasts. Nothing was left to chance. Nothing except the elderly man who now threatened to become an unwelcome focal point. Alessandro Moretti had spent 63 years hunched over work tables in back rooms of fashion houses, his fingers creating magic that others claimed credit for. Those same fingers, now being treated like contaminated instruments, had sewn the very midnight blue suit causing such admiration. He'd traveled from his small Brooklyn apartment, taking 3 subway transfers and walking 6 blocks in the November chill, just to see his final masterpiece before retiring. He never planned to touch it. The impulse had been unconscious, like a parent reaching for a child. The fabric knew him better than it knew the mannequin. In the 15 seconds it took Johnny Depp to cross the room, the atmosphere transformed. His purposeful stride carried none of his usual laid-back demeanor. Here was not the quirky celebrity known for eccentric roles, but a man whose eyes reflected something harder, recognition of an injustice unfolding. Those close enough noticed his knuckles whitening around his glass, the subtle clench of his jaw beneath his perfectly maintained stubble. The crowd parted before him not just because of his fame, but because something in his energy commanded space. Phones aimed in his direction captured more than they bargained for, the beginning of something authentic in a room built on pretense. "Excuse me," Depp's voice carried that distinctive quality that had narrated countless films, now directed at the security guards. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." The words weren't loud, but they commanded attention like a perfectly delivered line in a silent theater. The security guards hesitated, caught between their instructions and the sudden presence of Hollywood royalty. Vivian Lancaster recovered first, her professional smile snapping back into place as she stepped forward, calculating the PR value of this unexpected celebrity interaction. "Mr. Depp, what an honor to have you join us tonight. I assure you, everything is under control. This gentleman was just leaving." Her voice dripped with practiced charm, but her eyes darted nervously to the cameras now focused on this unplanned scene. "We have strict policies about touching the merchandise." Alessandro stood frozen between the guards, his weathered face a map of confusion and embarrassment. Decades of remaining invisible in the background had not prepared him for becoming the center of attention. Around them, the elite crowd shifted uncomfortably, suddenly conscious of being witnesses rather than simply attendees. Some lowered their phones, sensing something too authentic for their carefully curated social media narratives. Others filmed more eagerly, recognizing the potential viral value of celebrity intervention. The air in the room seemed to thicken as status and expectation collided with something far more genuine. A waiter standing nearby nearly dropped his tray, his professional mask slipping to reveal a young man suddenly invested in what was unfolding. Another guest, a fashion blogger with 300,000 followers, was already typing frantically, determined to be the first to break whatever this was becoming. Johnny Depp's expression remained unreadable as he placed his champagne glass on a nearby table with deliberate care. He moved closer to Alessandro, standing beside him in a gesture that transformed the dynamic instantly. No longer was this an old man being escorted out. Now it was an elderly gentleman with Johnny Depp as his apparent advocate. The security guard's hands fell away without instruction. "You know," Depp said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearby, "I've always believed you can tell a lot about people by how they treat those they don't need to impress." His eyes met Vivienne's with calm intensity. Something in his gaze suggested he knew more than he was saying. Alessandro looked up at the actor, recognition dawning on his lined face. His hands, those masterful instruments that had created wearable art for decades, trembled slightly at his sides. The midnight blue suit on the mannequin caught the light, its hand-rolled lapels and invisible stitching a testament to skills nearly extinct in the age of mass production. Around them, a curious transformation rippled through the crowd. The atmosphere of exclusive celebration had shifted into something electric with potential. Those who had been dismissively amused now watched with uncertain expressions, sensing a realignment of power they hadn't anticipated. Even the soft background music seemed suddenly inappropriate, too frivolous for what was unfolding. A woman in a designer gown whispered to her companion, who shook his head slightly in response. A prominent fashion critic removed his glasses, polishing them unnecessarily as he observed with professional interest. The night had veered from its carefully planned script, and even those accustomed to controlling narratives could feel it. Something authentic had entered the room, and they were no longer simply consumers of luxury, but witnesses to a moment of truth. "This gentleman," Depp continued, maintaining that measured tone that commanded attention without seeking it, "What's your name, sir?" He turned slightly toward Alessandro, whose posture had begun to straighten almost imperceptibly. dignity returning in small increments. "Alessandro Moretti," the old man replied, his voice carrying the faint musical cadence of his Italian heritage despite decades in America. His weathered hands clasped together as if to keep them from reaching out again toward the suit that had drawn him forward earlier. "Mr. Moretti," Depp repeated, giving the name the weight of importance. "I'm curious why you were so drawn to this particular piece." The question hung in the air, an invitation extended in a room where Alessandro had been denied entry to the conversation. Vivienne stepped forward, her smile tightening. "Mr. Depp, while this is fascinating, we're running a scheduled event here. Perhaps we could—" "I made it," Alessandro interrupted, the words escaping like birds too long caged. His eyes widened slightly at his own boldness. A ripple of disbelief moved through the crowd. A silver-haired man in a bespoke suit scoffed audibly. "Ridiculous," he muttered to his companion. "Valmont designs are exclusive creations by—" "By whom?" Depp asked, addressing the silver-haired man directly. The question carried no aggression, only genuine curiosity. "I'm interested to know who actually cuts the cloth and pushes the needle through by hand." His eyes returned to Alessandro. "You were saying—" The security guards exchanged uncertain glances. This was far outside their protocols. One reached for his earpiece, presumably to request guidance from someone higher up the chain. Vivienne's professional veneer cracked slightly, a flash of calculation visible beneath as she tried to assess the best way to regain control of the situation without creating negative publicity. Alessandro's eyes drifted back to the midnight blue suit. The left inside pocket is lined with a piece of red silk. On that silk, there are 3 small initials embroidered in thread matched to the lining. His voice grew steady as he spoke of his craft. "A M.M. Alessandro Marco Moretti. I've signed my work this way for 63 years. No one sees it, but I know it's there." Phones were raised higher now, capturing every word. The room had gone completely silent. A woman in a designer dress worth more than Alessandro's annual pension leaned forward, her expression caught between skepticism and fascination. A young assistant who had been diligently refilling champagne glasses stood frozen, the bottle tilted in midair as she watched the scene unfold. Johnny Depp glanced at the midnight blue suit, then back to Vivienne. "Perhaps we could check?" His suggestion wasn't really a question. The challenge in it vibrated through the room, daring anyone to refuse. Vivienne's smile remained fixed, but panic flickered behind her eyes. "These pieces are prepared for sale, Mr. Departamento. We can't simply dismantle them on a whim based on unusual claims." She tried for a laugh that died quickly in the weighted silence. "It's not dismantling to check a pocket," Depp countered, his voice reasonable but unyielding. "Unless there's another reason you'd prefer not to verify Mr. Moretti's statement." The implication hung in the air like expensive perfume. A distinguished-looking man near the front, Edmund Valmont himself, stepped forward, his carefully maintained silver hair and impeccable charcoal suit marking him as fashion royalty. "What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Depp?" His voice carried the crisp edge of someone unused to having his authority questioned. "I'm not suggesting anything," Depp replied evenly. "I'm simply curious about the true artisans behind the price tags." He gestured toward Alessandro. "This gentleman claims to have created that suit with his own hands, and he's offered a simple way to verify it." Alessandro stood straighter now, years seeming to fall away as dignity returned to his bearing. Nearby guests found themselves instinctively stepping back, creating a small circle around the unfolding drama. A fashion journalist who had been mechanically documenting the showcase for her publication set her professional camera to video mode, sensing a story far more compelling than the one she'd come to cover. "I worked for Valmont for 47 years, Alessandro said, his voice finding strength. I made suits for presidents, for CEOs, for royalty, always in the back room, always invisible. This, he gestured toward the midnight blue suit, was to be my last creation before retirement. Emotion thickened his voice. I wanted to see it one last time. Edmund Valmont's expression hardened. "Security," he said sharply. "Please remove this man. And Mr. Depp, while we appreciate your presence here tonight, I must ask you not to disrupt our event with these theatrics." Johnny Depp didn't move. Instead, he pulled his phone from his pocket and began typing something. "Interesting. I'm curious. How many of your wealthy clients would be interested to learn that the exclusive Valmont craftsmanship they're paying small fortunes for actually comes from artisans you refuse to acknowledge?" He looked up from his phone. "I have over 60 million Twitter followers who might find this conversation enlightening." The room collectively held its breath. Someone's champagne glass shattered on the floor, the sound startlingly loud in the tension. Cameras captured every nuance of the standoff between Hollywood royalty and fashion elite. A young socialite standing nearby pressed her hand to her mouth, eyes wide above it as she watched career-ending potential unfold in real time. Edmund Valmont's composure cracked slightly, the polished veneer of success revealing hairline fractures of calculation beneath. He glanced at the phones recording the scene, mentally tabulating potential damage against the cost of concession. Vivienne stepped closer to him, whispering urgently into his ear, her perfectly manicured nails digging slightly into her palm in distress. "Perhaps," Valmont finally said, each word carefully measured, "we could accommodate a brief examination to clear up this misunderstanding." He gestured toward the mannequin with forced magnanimity. "For the sake of transparency." A young assistant, wide-eyed at being suddenly thrust into this drama, hurried forward to carefully remove the jacket from the mannequin under Vivienne's hawk-like supervision. The crowd pressed forward slightly, the evening's scheduled programming forgotten in favor of this unexpected reality show unfolding before them. The assistant held the jacket reverently, looking uncertainly between her boss and the elderly Italian. "May I?" Johnny Depp asked, extending his hands. After a tense moment, the assistant surrendered the garment to him rather than to her employer, an unconscious choice that spoke volumes about the shifting power in the room. With deliberate care, Depp turned the jacket inside out, examining the craftsmanship with knowing eyes before locating the left inside pocket. His fingers traced the edge of the silk lining visible there. Alessandro watched, his lined face a study in contained emotion, 63 years of invisible artistry hanging in the balance of this moment. Around him, the wealthy observers who had paid thousands for the privilege of attendance found themselves witnesses to something their money couldn't have purchased. Authenticity cutting through the carefully constructed artifice of exclusivity. "Would you look at that?" Depp said quietly, angling the pocket toward the light. He gestured for Alessandro to approach. "Mr. Moretti, would you show us what you were describing?" With careful movements born from decades of handling precious fabrics, Alessandro stepped forward and gently took the jacket. His weathered hands, once dismissed as contamination risks to the merchandise, now handled the garment with a familiarity that no one could mistake. He turned the pocket slightly, revealing the red silk lining, and there, visible to those closest, were 3 small letters embroidered in nearly invisible blue thread that matched the lining. A.M.M. "I put my signature in everything I create," Alessandro said softly. "No one sees it but me, but it makes the piece mine, somehow." A murmur rippled through the crowd, the undeniable evidence creating a palpable shift in the atmosphere. Edmund Valmont's face had gone rigid, a muscle twitching near his jaw. Vivienne looked as though she might faint, her professional smile now completely abandoned. One of the security guards who had been manhandling Alessandro minutes earlier took an unconscious step back, something like shame crossing his face. From the back of the crowd, someone began to applaud, tentatively at first, then with growing conviction. A fashion blogger who'd been live streaming the entire exchange to her followers was narrating in urgent whispers. "You're watching history being made in the fashion world right now. This is incredible." Johnny Depp handed the jacket back to Alessandro with a gesture that conveyed both respect and permission, a subtle transfer of ownership that everyone in the room could read. The elderly tailor held his creation with reverent hands, the weight of it familiar, yet somehow different now that his connection to it had been revealed. 47 years, Depp said, his voice carrying through the hushed room without effort. Creating masterpieces that others put their names on. I'm curious, Mr. Valmont, how many of these exclusive Valmont designs were actually born from Mr. Moretti's hands? Edmund Valmont's mouth opened and closed, his usual eloquence deserting him. A lifetime of carefully constructed narratives teetered on the edge of collapse. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its authoritative edge. Our house employs many skilled craftspeople. They're all compensated for— That wasn't my question, Depp interrupted, his tone gentle but unyielding. How many of the pieces in this room, the ones you're selling for small fortunes, were created by this man? He gestured toward Alessandro, who stood quietly cradling the midnight blue jacket, his eyes now holding a dignity that transcended the room's opulence. A woman in the front row, diamonds dripping from her ears and throat, stepped forward unexpectedly. "My anniversary suit," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "The one you made for my husband. The blue pinstripe with the special lining that matched our wedding colors." She addressed Alessandro directly. "Did you make that too?" Alessandro looked at her, recognition dawning. "For your 20th anniversary. Sapphire blue silk lining with small silver embroidered stars. Your wedding was under the stars in Tuscany." He smiled slightly. "I put a single red thread in the constellation pattern to represent Mars, the planet visible the night you met." The woman's hand flew to her mouth, eyes widening. "How could you possibly know that?" "Edmund told me it was his personal design inspiration." Others began to murmur, looking at their own purchases with new eyes. Across the room, the atmosphere transformed as realization spread. The exclusive designs they'd paid fortunes for came not from the famous name on the label, but from the weathered hands of the man who'd been treated like an intruder. A prominent CEO who had commissioned a custom suit for his daughter's wedding stepped forward. "The inside jokes I requested to be hidden in the lining pattern. That was you." Alessandro nodded. "The mathematical equations and the small cartoon bear in the corner. Your daughter is a mathematician who collects teddy bears." A smile touched his lined face. "I enjoyed that challenge." Another guest joined in. "The vintage-style suit I ordered with fabric matching my grandfather's from the 1940s. I studied photographs for weeks to get the pattern weight exactly right," Alessandro confirmed. "And I added the replica cigarette burn on the inside cuff, invisible to others but authentic to the original." With each revelation, the balance of power in the room shifted further. Phones captured every moment, but many had stopped recording and were simply watching, transfixed by the unfolding truth. Edmund Valmont and Vivian stood frozen, witnesses to the dismantling of their carefully crafted illusion of exclusivity. Johnny Depp watched the scene unfold with quiet satisfaction, a witness to this moment of reckoning. He turned to Edmund Valmont, who seemed to have aged years in minutes, the carefully maintained facade of fashion royalty crumbling before a room full of his most valuable clients. "You know," Depp said conversationally, "I've spent my career wearing masks, playing characters. The difference is, my audience knows it's a performance. He gestured around the room. "But you've been selling a story that wasn't yours to tell, charging a premium for craftsmanship you claimed as your own vision." Alessandro gently folded the midnight blue jacket with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime honoring fabric. His movements drew eyes throughout the room, the practiced care, the reverence for material, the decades of mastery evident in each fold. "I never minded staying in the shadows," Alessandro said, addressing the room rather than any individual. "The work was enough, knowing that something made by these hands would carry someone through important moments of their lives." He looked down at his weathered fingers. "But to be treated as though I might damage my own creation, that was too much." Edmund Valmont stepped forward, his business instincts finally overriding his shock. "Alessandro has been a valued member of our atelier for many years," he began, attempting to reclaim the narrative. "Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding about recognition, but Valmont has always— My retirement package was a gold watch and $50 for each year of service." Alessandro interrupted, his voice quiet but clear. $2,350 for nearly 5 decades creating designs that sold for millions. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A fashion critic who had written glowing reviews of Valmont's visionary craftsmanship for years looked physically ill, realizing how thoroughly he'd been deceived and how complicit he'd been in perpetuating the myth. "That's standard industry practice," Vivian interjected desperately. "Our artisans are compensated fairly according to—" "According to what?" Depp challenged. "The idea that the hands that create the art are worth less than the name that claims it." He turned, addressing the crowd directly now. "Look at these two men. One has spent decades creating beauty with his hands, pouring his life into craftsmanship most of us can't even comprehend. The other has spent those same decades building a brand by taking credit for that artistry." The statement hung in the air, impossible to refute. Alessandro stood quietly, the folded jacket held against his chest, dignity emanating from him like a physical force. Edmund Valmont seemed to shrink beside him, the Emperor revealed to have no clothes. A prominent fashion magazine editor stepped forward, her expression resolved. "Alessandro, would you mind if I interviewed you? I think the world needs to know the true artist behind these creations." Before Alessandro could answer, others joined in. "I'd like to commission you directly for my next suit. Would you consider teaching master classes? I'd sponsor a series. My fashion house would be honored to create a line with your name properly attached." The offers poured forth, a tide of recognition washing away decades of invisibility. Alessandro's eyes widened slightly, overwhelmed by the sudden reversal. Through it all, the midnight blue jacket remained clutched to his chest, the physical embodiment of his life's work finally acknowledged. Johnny Depp raised a hand, gently quieting the surge of voices competing for Alessandro's attention. "I think," he said, his voice carrying that distinctive quality that had narrated beloved films for decades, "we're witnessing something important here, more than just one man's overdue recognition." He looked around the room, making eye contact with various guests. "We're seeing the moment when we remember what truly matters in what we wear, what we buy, what we value." He turned to Alessandro. "Mr. Moretti has spent a lifetime creating beauty that others claimed as their vision. He's put his hands, his eyes, his heart into making things that matter." Depp gestured to his own simple but perfectly tailored jacket. "This was made by someone too. Someone whose name I should probably know." The room fell silent, the weight of collective realization settling over the guests. Many looked down at their own designer clothing with new eyes, suddenly conscious of the anonymous hands that had crafted their status symbols. Edmund Valmont, sensing his empire crumbling in real time, made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Valmont Designs has always valued our artisans," he declared, professional smile plastered back in place. "In fact, we've been developing a new recognition program to highlight their contributions. Tonight's unfortunate misunderstanding actually presents the perfect opportunity to announce that Alessandro Moretti will be the first featured master in our new Hands Behind the Brand initiative." The transparent attempt at damage control hung in the air, its hollowness apparent to everyone. Alessandro's quiet dignity made the desperate ploy seem even more pathetic by contrast. "Too late, Edmund," came a voice from the crowd, the fashion critic who'd been championing Valmont Designs for years. "You had half a century to recognize him. It took Johnny Depp and an act of public humiliation to make you see the human being behind your profits." He turned to Alessandro. "I owe you an apology as well. I've praised countless garments you created without ever knowing your name." Vivienne, still trying to maintain control, stepped forward with forced brightness. "Let's all take a moment to celebrate Alessandro with a toast. Champagne for everyone." "I don't want a toast," Alessandro said, his voice gentle but firm. "I don't want sudden recognition or apologies." He looked down at the midnight blue jacket in his hands, then back up at the room full of elite fashion consumers. "I want the world to remember that beautiful things come from human hands, not brand names. Every perfect stitch, every invisible seam that makes you feel magnificent when you wear it, that comes from someone whose name you'll probably never know." He carefully returned the jacket to the stunned assistant who had removed it from the mannequin earlier. "This belongs on display. It's my last creation for Valmont, and I'm proud of it." With simple dignity, he turned to Johnny Depp. "Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible." The room was utterly silent now, the usual background chatter of exclusive events completely absent. In its place was something rarely found in such carefully curated spaces: authenticity. Phones had largely been lowered, their owners too absorbed in the moment to document it. The handful still recording would later find their videos going viral not just for the celebrity involvement, but for the raw human truth at its center. The showcase continued in name only. The scheduled program of exclusive reveals and carefully orchestrated sales pitches had been abandoned, replaced by something far more valuable. Alessandro found himself surrounded by guests eager to speak with him, to hear about the processes behind their cherished garments, to learn about the invisible details he'd incorporated into their bespoke pieces. The Invisible Man had become the center of attention, his knowledge and passion finally finding an audience. Edmund Valmont and Vivienne had retreated to a corner, huddled in urgent conversation with their PR team who had been summoned from the back rooms. Their expressions cycled between panic and forced composure as they attempted to formulate a response to what was quickly becoming a viral moment. Nearby, journalists who had come expecting to write standard coverage of luxury fashion were instead frantically updating their stories, sensing a seismic shift in the industry narrative. Johnny Depp stood slightly apart, watching with quiet satisfaction as Alessandro gestured animatedly while explaining the complexities of hand-rolled lapels to an entranced group of former Valmont devotees. The elderly artisan seemed to grow younger by the minute, energized by finally being able to speak openly about his life's work. When Alessandro caught Depp's eye across the room, the simple nod they exchanged carried more meaning than words could have conveyed. A respected fashion historian who happened to be in attendance approached Depp, champagne flute in hand. "You know," she said quietly, "what you've done here tonight goes beyond just one man's recognition. You've pulled back the curtain on the entire industry's dirty secret." She gestured subtly toward Alessandro, now showing a young designer the nearly invisible technique he used for reinforcing seams. Fashion houses have been erasing their artisans for centuries, building empires on anonymous hands. this might actually change something. Depp swirled the remaining liquid in his glass thoughtfully. "I just couldn't watch it happen," he replied, the look on his face when they pulled him away from his own creation. He trailed off, then added, "Fame is a strange currency, mostly worthless, except in moments when it can be exchanged for something real." Across the room, the energy had transformed completely. Phones that had been capturing glamour shots of exclusive designs were now recording Alessandro's impromptu masterclass. A garment that had been admired earlier for its brand name was now being appreciated for the hundreds of hours of skilled labor evident in its construction. The subtle shift represented something profound, a reconnection with the human element of luxury that had been systematically erased by marketing and branding. By morning, the videos had spread across every platform. Alessandro Moretti and the hands behind the brand were trending globally, spawning thousands of conversations about the unseen artisans behind luxury goods. Fashion publications scrambled to secure exclusive interviews with the elderly tailor, whose story had captured the public imagination. Social media accounts belonging to major fashion houses suddenly featured posts highlighting their own craftspeople, a transparent attempt to get ahead of the wave Alessandro's story had created. 3 days after the showcase, Johnny Depp posted a single photo to his Instagram, himself sitting beside Alessandro in what appeared to be a modest tailor's workshop, both men smiling as Alessandro demonstrated a stitching technique. The caption was simple: "Learning from a true master. Some hands create art that others merely sell. Proud to call Alessandro Moretti my friend and now my personal tailor." The post received millions of likes within hours, further cementing the narrative that had begun that night. Valmont Designs issued a carefully worded statement announcing their new Artisan Recognition Initiative, attempting to reframe the viral incident as a planned revelation that had unfortunately been misinterpreted by some attendees. The transparent damage control was immediately called out by those who had witnessed the event, including several influential clients who publicly announced they would be taking their business elsewhere, specifically to wherever Alessandro decided to work next. Fashion schools reached out with teaching offers. Museums contacted Alessandro about exhibiting his work and recording his techniques for posterity. A documentary filmmaker began following him, capturing his stories of decades spent creating invisible perfection. At 68, Alessandro Moretti found himself with something he'd never expected: choices. The midnight blue suit that had been the catalyst for the entire event was withdrawn from sale by Valmont. 2 weeks later, it appeared in Alessandro's first solo exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Costume Institute, displayed alongside a large photograph of the hands that had created it, every wrinkle and callus visible in loving detail. The accompanying plaque included a quote from Alessandro: "Every stitch is a moment of my life, preserved in something that will outlive me." 6 months later, Johnny Depp arrived at the Academy Awards wearing a striking tuxedo with subtle, unconventional details. When interviewers on the red carpet asked the inevitable, "Who are you wearing?" question, he turned to reveal a small, elegant tag sewn into the outside of the collar, replacing the hidden interior brand label with a visible attribution: "Created by Alessandro Moretti." The moment sparked a new trend among celebrities conscious of the statement they could make with their fashion choices. Alessandro declined most of the lucrative offers that came his way, instead choosing to establish a small school in Brooklyn where he taught his techniques to young artisans from backgrounds typically excluded from the fashion elite. His only condition for students: they must sign their work, visibly or invisibly, but always with pride. "No more anonymous hands," became his gentle rallying cry, a philosophy that spread through the industry with surprising speed as other master craftspeople, emboldened by his example, began stepping forward to claim their work. Edmond Valmont announced his retirement that same year, citing a desire to return to the roots of craftsmanship. Industry insiders recognized the forced exit for what it was, the fashion world's equivalent of a golden parachute before being pushed from the plane. Valmont Designs underwent a complete rebranding, their new business model built around transparent attribution of every garment to its actual creator. The fashion industry didn't transform overnight. Systems built on exploitation rarely do. But something fundamental had shifted. Consumers began asking questions they'd never thought to ask before. Who made this? Whose hands touched this? Whose vision truly created this? The anonymous craftsperson had gained a foothold in the public consciousness. On the one-year anniversary of that fateful night, Johnny Depp hosted a private dinner at a small Italian restaurant in Brooklyn. The guest list included Alessandro, several of his students, and a handful of other master craftspeople whose work had long gone unrecognized by the brands that employed them. No photographers were present, no social media posts marked the occasion. It wasn't about publicity anymore. It was about honoring the human connection that had begun with a simple act of recognition. As Alessandro raised his glass in toast, his weathered hands now recognized by millions, he offered words that captured the journey of the past year. To hands that create, to eyes that see us, and to the courage to stand in the light after a lifetime in shadow. Around the table, artisans whose work had adorned the wealthy and powerful for decades clinked glasses, no longer invisible. The true measure of change wasn't in hashtags or headlines, but in this moment of quiet dignity. Craftspeople taking their rightful place at the table, their names finally attached to their legacy.